In the dust-laden winds that sweep across central Anatolia, there lies a memory carved not in marble or bronze, but in the fragile soil beneath our feet. A memory of an empire that rose in silence, ruled in thunder, and vanished with barely a whisper. This is the story of the Hittites, a people who forged power from isolation, diplomacy from necessity, and iron from the very bones of the earth, long before the rest of the world even knew such a metal could be mastered. As we begin this journey, let us imagine the world not as we know it, but as it was more than 3.5 millennia ago. The great kingdoms of the ancient Near East were still young. Egypt was flourishing along the Nile, under the shadow of its colossal pyramids. In Mesopotamia, the echoes of Sumer and Akkad lingered in crumbling ziggurats. Traders moved across deserts with caravans of copper, tin, wool, and obsidian. A land of mountain ridges, deep valleys, and scattered city-states, each with its own gods, its own dialects, and its own fragile alliances. Into this fractured world emerged a people who would change the trajectory of ancient history. They called themselves the Nesili speakers of the language of Nessa, but the rest of the ancient world would one day know them as the Hittites. The earliest chapters of their rise were not written in monuments, but in clay tablets. Tablets discovered in a ruined city once called Hattusa, buried for 3,000 years beneath layers of ash and broken stone. On these tablets is recorded the story of a tribal chieftain turned conqueror, a man named Labarna, or as traditions later remembered him, Hattusili I. Before his reign, the Hittites were just one of many small powers scattered across central Anatolia. But under Hattusili, they became something new, a kingdom with ambition, a kingdom with an identity, a kingdom not content with survival, but hungry for supremacy. The rise did not begin in a palace, it began in fire. Whether symbolic, strategic, or necessary, the act defined the tone of his dynasty. The old must fall so the new may stand. From this reborn fortress he expanded outward, forging alliances, crushing rivals, and carving a path across the region. What made the Hittites unusual was not simply their willingness to wage war. Many kingdoms did that, but their ability to absorb what they conquered. Instead of erasing the cultures they subdued, they often incorporated them. Foreign gods were welcomed, foreign customs were woven into Hittite life. This flexibility was one of the hidden engines of their rise. We must picture central Anatolia at this time not as a barren wilderness but as a mosaic of cultures. The Hattians, the Hurrians, the Luwians, and others lived side by side with the early Hittites. Each brought their language, their rituals, their understanding of the world. Over centuries, these elements blended under Hittite rule, creating a unique civilization, unlike any other in the Near East. A civilization that valued tradition, law, and negotiation as much as battlefield conquest. Yet conquest did play its role. To the southeast lay Aleppo, a powerful city-state that controlled key trade routes to Mesopotamia. To challenge Aleppo was to challenge the established powers of the Levant, and Hattusili did exactly that. His campaigns against Aleppo, though only partly successful, opened the way for his successors. When he grew old, he recorded his achievements and disappointments in one of history's earliest political testaments, a document that would influence kings for generations. In it, he did something extraordinary. He rebuked his own descendants for betrayal, warning them of the dangers of internal division. The warning was well-founded. After Hattusili's death, the throne did not pass smoothly. His designated heir, a man named Mursili, inherited not peace, but an unfinished plan. A plan that would bring the Hittites into the heart of Near Eastern power politics. Mursili was young, ambitious, and fearless. He completed the conquest of Aleppo, but he did not stop there. Captured by the promise of destiny, he pushed even farther south until he reached the walls of Babylon itself. In an act that stunned the ancient world, Mursili attacked and sacked Babylon over 1,000 kilometers from his homeland, toppling the dynasty of Hammurabi. It was a strike so far-reaching that later chroniclers barely believed it happened. Mursili was assassinated upon his return home, plunging the Hittite kingdom into chaos. The next century was a storm of rebellions, rival claimants, and shifting alliances. For a time, it seemed the Hittite rise might have been a brief flare, destined to fade into obscurity. But the Hittites were resilient. Their identity, this blend of cultures and gods, gave them a strange endurance. Kings came and went, but the system survived. Rival factions battled, but the kingdom held. And slowly, through these trials, the Hittites forged something stronger than conquest. They forged stability. It was during this period that the Hittites refined one of their greatest contributions to history: law. Hittite law codes were radically humane for their time, unlike many earlier legal systems, including the harsh justice of Hammurabi. Hittite law often replaced death sentences with fines, compensation, or negotiated settlements. The laws reveal a society deeply concerned with fairness, property rights, family stability, and the responsibilities of rulers. For a kingdom born from conquest, it is remarkable how much emphasis they placed on justice. A justice designed not to terrify, but to maintain order. Perhaps it was this sense of order that allowed the Hittites to rise again under a king named Superluliuma I. If the early conquests had made the Hittites visible, it was Superluliuma who made them legendary. When he ascended the throne, the kingdom was fractured, hemmed in by enemies, and overshadowed by the rising power of Mitanni to the east. Mitanni was a formidable state with strong chariot forces and influence stretching into the lands of Syria. Superluliuma changed everything. He reorganized his military. He revitalized administration. He engaged in diplomacy with cunning precision, forging alliances where brute force failed. And when the time came, he unleashed his armies in a series of campaigns that shattered Mitanni dominance and extended Hittite influence deep into Syria. Under his leadership, the Hittites became one of the great superpowers of the Late Bronze Age. The world at this time was dominated by a handful of massive empires: Egypt, Mitanni, Babylon, Assyria, and now, unmistakably, the Hittite Empire. These powers interacted diplomatically in what modern historians sometimes call the Club of Great Kings, an elite group whose letters, treaties, and negotiations have survived in the tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets. Through these documents, we see the Hittites emerge as equals to the pharaohs of Egypt, exchanging gifts, envoys, and even royal marriage alliances. Yet even as the Hittite Empire reached its zenith, danger lingered at the horizon. In Egypt, a young and ambitious pharaoh was asserting his power. Ramesses II, later known as Ramesses the Great. His goal was nothing less than reclaiming the territories Egypt had once held in Syria, territories now under Hittite influence. This rivalry reached its climax at Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history. Though both sides claimed victory, the result was essentially a stalemate. But this moment set the stage for one of the most remarkable achievements of the ancient world: the first known recorded peace treaty in human history, signed between the Hittites and the Egyptians. This peace treaty was no minor accord. It was a symbol of a world becoming interconnected, negotiated, and diplomatically sophisticated centuries before the rise of Greece or Rome. Inscribed on clay tablets in Hattusa and carved into temple walls in Egypt, the treaty demonstrated how far the Hittites had risen. They were no longer a mysterious people from the Anatolian highlands. They were now co-architects of international order. But empires are fragile, and the Hittite Empire, for all its strength, faced challenges that even its diplomatic brilliance could not overcome. Internal rivalries once again tore at the royal family. Vassal states in Syria rebelled, and a mysterious wave of migration and warfare, known today as the Sea Peoples, swept across the eastern Mediterranean, destabilizing kingdoms and severing trade routes. The Hittites, dependent on imported grain and fragile alliances, were especially vulnerable. As famine spread through Anatolia, letters from Hattusa begged Egypt for food shipments, just to keep the population alive. Local kings withdrew their loyalty. Provinces fell to invaders or broke into independence. And then, almost without warning, Hattusa, the heart of the empire, was abandoned and burned, not by one enemy, but by the weight of many pressures converging at once. When the fires died and the last survivors fled into the mountains, the Hittite Empire vanished from history. For centuries after their fall, the world forgot them. The Bible mentioned them in passing, but scholars dismissed these references as myth. No one believed such a powerful empire had existed in the Anatolian highlands. It was only in the 19th century, after explorers uncovered inscriptions and archaeologists began excavating Hattusa, that the Hittites returned to the world's memory. Thousands of clay tablets, monumental gates, and carved reliefs revealed an empire far more complex and influential than anyone had imagined. And yet, even today, much about the Hittites remains shrouded in mystery. We still debate their origins. We still decipher their tablets. We still reconstruct their battles, rituals, and daily lives from fragments. From their early adoption of ironworking to their innovative diplomacy, from their legal reforms to their multicultural identity, the Hittites left behind a legacy more ambitious than their age could fully grasp. As we close our journey through the untold rise of the Hittite Empire, we must remember that history is built not only by the victors, but also by those who vanished before their stories could be fully told. The Hittites remind us that entire civilizations can rise to extraordinary heights, shaping diplomacy, warfare, language, and law, and yet be forgotten for millennia. But now, their voices speak again, through shattered tablets, through ruined fortresses, through the silent stones of Hattusa, through the echoes of an empire that was once mighty enough to challenge Egypt itself. The Hittites rose from obscurity, forged a world-class superpower, and disappeared, leaving behind mysteries that still intrigue us today. Their story is a reminder that history is not a straight line, but a landscape of forgotten giants, resurrected through the persistence of curiosity and the patience of archaeology. And as long as we continue searching, the Hittites will never be forgotten again. As we continue our exploration of the untold rise of the Hittite Empire, we must journey deeper into the minds, rituals, and beliefs that held this ancient powerhouse together. An empire does not survive for centuries, merely on the strength of armies or the sharpness of its generals. It endures because its people share a worldview, a framework of ideas that gives purpose to their struggle and legitimacy to their kings. For the Hittites, that framework was a complex tapestry of myth, ritual, and divine negotiation. In the Hittite world, the gods were everywhere, but unlike the pantheons of Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Hittite religion was not a fixed hierarchy. Instead, it was an ever-expanding collection. A vast assembly they proudly called the 1,000 gods of Hatti. One by one, as the Hittites conquered new lands, they absorbed the local gods of those regions. They honored them, recorded their rituals, and built them temples. This unusual openness was not merely tolerance, it was strategy. It provided spiritual stability to newly conquered territories, making them more loyal and less likely to revolt. And so, within the sacred city of Hattusa, priests performed ceremonies borrowed from dozens of cultures, Hattian rites, Hurrian hymns, Luwian chants, and rituals inherited from lands far beyond the Taurus Mountains. At the heart of this religious universe stood two powerful deities, the storm god and the sun goddess of Arena. Together, they represented divine order. The king, in turn, was their earthly representative, chosen to maintain balance in a world constantly threatened by chaos. This belief in cosmic balance influenced every aspect of Hittite life. In times of drought or disaster, the king would consult oracles, seek divine instructions, and perform atonement rituals to restore harmony. Even political treaties were framed not merely as agreements between rulers, but as sacred oaths witnessed by the gods themselves. Breaking a treaty was not just a political betrayal, it was a cosmic offense. And it was this religious worldview that gave the Hittites a remarkable political tool: The vassal treaty was an innovation that turned the Hittite Empire into a diplomatic machine. Instead of occupying every conquered region with overwhelming military presence, something no ancient empire had the resources to do, the Hittites bound their subject kings with sacred, legally precise agreements. These treaties spelled out obligations, loyalty, tribute payments, military support, and the protection of Hittite trade routes. But they also included clauses that protected the vassals, ensuring they could not be arbitrarily deposed or mistreated. In return for obedience, they received the empire's protection. These documents often began by recounting the generosity of the Hittite king, praising his mercy and reminding the vassal of the benefits they enjoyed under his rule. Then came warnings, not threats from the Hittite army, but curses invoked in the names of the gods. Anyone who violated the treaty would suffer divine retribution. Famine, plague, defeat, madness. In a world where the gods were believed to govern every aspect of life, these curses carried immense weight. Through such treaties, the Hittites controlled an empire stretching from the Aegean coast to the banks of the Euphrates River. They commanded the loyalty of countless kings without permanently stationing troops in each region. Theirs was an empire woven through law, diplomacy, and ideology, supported by military power, but not wholly dependent on it. Yet power, once gained, must be defended, and the Hittites knew better than most that their position was precarious. Surrounded by ambitious rivals, threatened by shifting alliances, they had to adapt constantly to survive. One of their greatest challenges came not from the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians, but from within Anatolia itself. The western part of the peninsula was home to the Arzawa lands, a collection of kingdoms that alternated between reluctant allies and open enemies of the Hittites. These lands were rich in resources and strategically essential for controlling trade routes to the Aegean Sea. Over the centuries, the Hittites launched multiple campaigns into Arzawa territory. Each one met with fierce resistance. These wars were grueling not only because of the stubbornness of the Arzawan kings, but also because of the rugged terrain forests, mountains, and river valleys that made rapid troop movement nearly impossible. Yet the Hittites persisted, for they understood a crucial truth. Without control of western Anatolia, they would forever be vulnerable to foreign influence from the Aegean and beyond. It was during these wars that the Hittites refined another of their political strategies: the deportation of populations. Unlike modern concepts of forced displacement, the Hittite version was often a calculated effort to avoid rebellion. When a region was conquered, large segments of its population were sometimes relocated to central Anatolia, where they were distributed among loyal communities or given land in sparsely populated areas. This dispersed dangerous factions and repopulated areas devastated by famine or war. Though harsh, this policy helped maintain stability across the empire for generations. But stability in the Bronze Age was fleeting. To the northeast, a rising power was emerging: the Kingdom of Assyria. Once overshadowed by Mitanni and Babylon, Assyria was rapidly transforming into a militaristic force. The Hittites, who had enjoyed decades of dominance in Syria, suddenly found themselves facing a new challenger eager to expand westward. Diplomatic letters from this era reveal the tension between the two powers. Assyrian kings complained that Hittite treaties with Syrian states infringed on their interests. The Hittites, in turn, warned Assyria to respect their territories. At times, the two kingdoms appeared on the brink of war, but neither could afford open conflict, while Egypt remained a looming presence in the south. This created a delicate balance, a balance that might have continued were it not for the unpredictable tides of destiny. As generations passed, Hittite kings struggled to maintain the empire's cohesion. The pressures of ruling such a widespread and culturally diverse realm began to show. Tax burdens grew heavier. Local governors abused their power. Some vassal states, weary of Hittite oversight, began quietly seeking alliances with Egypt or Assyria. And then came one of the most intriguing events in ancient history: the death of an Egyptian prince and the desperate letter of an Egyptian queen. After the death of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, his young widow, Ankhesenamun, wrote to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma, asking for one of his sons to become her husband and the next pharaoh of Egypt. Such a proposition was unheard of. No Egyptian royal had ever invited a foreigner to ascend the throne. But after further correspondence confirmed its authenticity, he sent one of his sons, Prince Zananza, to marry the queen. Zananza never arrived. He was murdered somewhere along the route, likely by a faction in Egypt that opposed foreign influence. Suppiluliuma was enraged. He blamed Egypt and launched a series of retaliatory campaigns in Syria, capturing cities and destabilizing the entire region. But in doing so, he inadvertently opened the gates to disaster. His troops brought back Egyptian prisoners and with them, a deadly plague. The epidemic spread quickly through the Hittite heartland, killing thousands. Among the victims were Suppiluliuma himself and his eldest son. The empire reeled from the loss, its leadership shaken at the worst possible moment. The new king, Mursili II, inherited not a thriving empire, but one struggling under the weight of plague, rebellion, and political fragmentation. Yet Mursili rose to the challenge. His numerous prayer inscriptions reveal a king burdened by divine crises and deeply devoted to restoring order. He launched campaigns to reclaim rebellious territories, invoked rituals to appease the gods, and worked tirelessly to re-establish the authority his father had lost. Under his rule, and later under the famed Hattusa III and Tudela IV, the empire experienced a final resurgence, a golden twilight. They rebuilt Hattusa, strengthened their borders, and maintained uneasy peace with Egypt, Assyria, and other great powers. But the storm was coming. Across the Mediterranean, civilizations were collapsing. Trade networks broke down. Entire cities were abandoned. A combination of wars, migrations, internal strife, and climate change triggered what modern historians call the Bronze Age collapse. A sudden, widespread destruction of societies that had flourished for centuries. For the Hittites, the collapse was catastrophic. As grain shortages worsened, the king wrote to Egypt pleading for massive grain shipments simply to prevent starvation. Enemy coalitions attacked key cities in Syria. Rebellions erupted in western Anatolia. And then came the final blow. Invasions from groups we now call the Sea Peoples. Warriors and migrants moving unpredictably across the region, burning settlements and destabilizing systems everywhere they went. Hattusa could not endure. The once mighty capital was abandoned and set ablaze. Royal archives were buried beneath rubble. The empire dissolved into small Neo-Hittite states that survived for centuries but never regained the power of their ancestors. For 3,000 years, the Hittites slipped into silence, until archaeologists rediscovered them. The discovery of the empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was nothing short of a revelation. It rewrote the history of the ancient world. Scholars uncovered a people who negotiated peace with pharaohs, wrote laws ahead of their time, and mastered diplomacy in an age of monarchs and myths. They found fortresses built with cyclopean stones, temples decorated with intricate reliefs of gods and kings, and archives filled with international correspondence. For the first time in millennia, the Hittites spoke again. Their language, once lost, was deciphered. Their stories, once buried, were revived. Their presence, once forgotten, became undeniable. And yet, mysteries remain. What exactly caused the final collapse? Why were the cities abandoned so suddenly? What role did climate shifts, invasions, or political struggles play? How did the Neo-Hittite kingdoms preserve fragments of the old culture? These questions continue to inspire research, excavations, and debate among historians. The Hittites have returned to the world stage not as forgotten shadows, but as vital contributors to the human story. Their rise was unlikely. Their power was immense. Their disappearance was sudden. Their rediscovery was transformative. And their legacy is still unfolding. To understand the Hittite Empire not merely as a sequence of kings and battles, we must step into the lived experience of its people. The farmers who worked the Anatolian earth, the scribes who pressed words into clay, the soldiers who rode in thundering chariots, and the priests who carried offerings through sacred courtyards dense with incense. Only then can we grasp how a civilization so intricate flourished for centuries in a landscape both beautiful and unforgiving. Picture a village in the Hittite highlands. Stone houses clustered along narrow paths, roofs of timber and clay, hillsides dotted with sheep and goats, streams trickling down from mountain springs. Life here was shaped by the seasons, harsh winters, cool summers, and the constant challenge of coaxing grain from rocky soil. The people grew wheat and barley, tended orchards, and kept cattle. Their tools were simple, but their understanding of the land was profound, passed down over generations. In many ways, these rural communities were the backbone of the empire. Their harvests fed armies and supplied cities. Their taxes filled royal granaries, and their loyalty quietly maintained despite wars and shifting alliances, allowed the Hittite kings to rule a territory stretching hundreds of miles in every direction. Yet life in villages was not isolated from the broader affairs of the empire. Travelers, merchants, and government messengers moved regularly along roads connecting Anatolia's cities. News of royal decrees, treaties, and wars reached even the smallest settlements. And in times of crisis, such as drought or invasion, the impact was felt directly. Fields went unplowed. Livestock was seized for military use. Families were displaced. The fate of the empire was never abstract. It shaped the rhythms of everyday survival. If we travel from the countryside to the capital, we encounter a very different world. Hattusa was not an ordinary city. Built across a massive outcrop of rock and surrounded by mountain ridges, it was a grand statement of power carved into the landscape itself. Its walls, some stretching for kilometers, rose along the contours of the terrain, punctuated by monumental gates adorned with lions, sphinxes, and warriors carved into stone. These sculptures were not merely decorative. They symbolized divine protection and the king's authority. Inside its walls, Hattusa was a labyrinth of palaces, barracks, workshops, temples, and administrative complexes. Hundreds of scribes worked tirelessly in archives, copying treaties, recording grain deliveries, writing royal letters, and preserving myths. Their script, cuneiform adapted from Mesopotamia, captured the breath of an entire civilization. Through their tablets, the Hittites spoke to us across millennia. The Great Temple, one of the largest religious structures in the ancient Near East, stood as the spiritual heart of the empire. Its courtyards and storage rooms, once filled with offerings of wine, grain, honey, and livestock, testified to the ritual life that sustained the bond between the gods and the people. Festivals punctuated the year, elaborate ceremonies involving processions, music, feasting, and sacred drama. These rituals were not mere superstition. They were believed to maintain cosmic order, ensuring the prosperity of the kingdom. Among the rituals, none was more important than the Puruli festival, a grand celebration of spring and renewal. It retold the myth of the storm god's battle against the serpent Iluyanka, a tale of defeat, trickery, and ultimate victory. The myth symbolized the eternal struggle between chaos and order, a theme deeply embedded in Hittite thought. As priests recited the story and offerings were made, the people believed they were helping the gods restore balance to the world. If religion provided spiritual cohesion, the Hittite military provided physical security. The Hittite army was a formidable force, built on discipline, organization, and logistical precision. It was not the largest military in the ancient world, but it was among the most adaptable. Infantry formed the bulk of the force, equipped with spears, shields, and bronze armor. But the true strength of the Hittite military lay in its chariot corps. Hittite chariots were engineering marvels, lighter than earlier designs, sturdier than many rivals, and capable of carrying 3 men, a driver, a warrior, and a shield-bearer. This 3-man crew gave Hittite chariots stability and striking power, especially in rough terrain. On open fields, they moved in formations that could overwhelm enemy lines. On uneven ground, they maintained mobility, better than their Egyptian counterparts, which typically carried only 2 men. The clash at Kadesh showcased this military sophistication. Though the battle ended in stalemate, It highlighted the skill, courage, and coordination of Hittite charioteers. Their ability to maneuver in tight formations, retreat strategically, and launch devastating counterattacks became a defining feature of late Bronze Age warfare. But war was not fought only on distant fields. It seeped into the homes and hearts of the people. Letters discovered at Hattusa reveal the human cost of conflict. Wives begging for news of missing husbands, governors pleading for reinforcements, and vassal kings sending desperate messages for support. The empire's strength rested not only on strategy, but on the sacrifices of countless families whose lives were shaped by battles far from home. Beyond warfare, the Hittites also influenced the world through innovation. They were among the earliest civilizations to work with iron. Although this technology was rare and ceremonial in their time, they developed sophisticated irrigation systems, advanced methods of animal husbandry, and detailed legal frameworks. Their laws covered everything from marriage and inheritance to theft, land disputes, and accidental injuries. These laws reveal a society that valued order, fairness, and compromise, a striking contrast to the harsher punishments found in some contemporary legal codes. Hittite diplomacy was equally advanced. Their archives contain letters exchanged with Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Cyprus, and various Syrian kingdoms. These letters shed light on international relations, conducted through gifts, marriage alliances, and negotiations. Gold, silver, ivory, textiles, horses, and exotic animals moved across borders as symbols of goodwill. Envoys traveled long distances, sometimes carrying dozens of tablets at a time. Diplomatic etiquette was strict, with elaborate rules governing greetings, titles, and the treatment of messengers. In these letters, we see the Hittites not as distant figures, but as real human beings. Kings frustrated by disrespect, queens seeking marriage alliances, generals pleading for supplies, and scribes struggling to maintain diplomatic protocols in troubled times. Yet even as we admire the complexity of this world, we must confront its fragility. The Bronze Age was built on networks, trade routes, political alliances, and economic interdependence. When these networks were disrupted, the system fell apart. For the Hittites, far from major agricultural centers, trade was not a luxury but a necessity. They needed grain from Egypt and Syria, copper from Cyprus, tin from Central Asia, and lumber from the mountains of the north. When wars, migrations, or climate changes cut these lifelines, the consequences were dire. As the 12th century BCE approached, the empire faced one crisis after another. Letters from this period show a kingdom under immense strain. Governors complained that they could not collect taxes. Merchants reported attacks on caravans. Vassal kings refused to obey orders. And then came the most ominous sign: famine. This famine was not a single event. It unfolded over years, perhaps decades. Crop failures became common. Winter storms grew harsher. Droughts plagued the land. The king wrote desperate letters asking neighboring powers for grain, but they too were suffering. The interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age was unraveling. And then came the final blow. The sea peoples whose origins remained debated swept through the eastern Mediterranean. Some were displaced farmers seeking new homes. Others were raiders, warriors, and opportunists. They attacked coastal cities, destroyed trade routes, and toppled kingdoms from the Aegean to the Levant. The Hittite Empire, weakened by internal divisions and food shortages, could not withstand this storm. Hattusa fell, not gradually, but violently. Its walls were breached, its temples were burned, its palaces were abandoned. Survivors fled into the countryside or joined new communities in the south, forming what historians later called the Neo-Hittite states. These smaller kingdoms preserved fragments of Hittite culture, their language, their art, their religious symbols, but the great empire was gone. For centuries afterward, the world forgot the Hittites. Their monuments crumbled. Their roads vanished beneath grass and soil. Their tablets lay buried, waiting for rediscovery. And then, In the 1800s and early 1900s, explorers and archaeologists began uncovering clues, inscriptions, reliefs, ruins. Slowly, piece by piece, the forgotten empire emerged from the shadows. When scholars deciphered the Hittite language, it was as if a lost civilization suddenly began speaking again, recounting its deeds, its struggles, and its rise to greatness. Today, the Hittite legacy stands as one of the most remarkable recoveries in archaeological history. It reminds us that the past still holds secrets waiting to be unearthed, that forgotten peoples can still shape our understanding of human civilization, and that even empires thought lost forever can return through the patient work of scholarship and exploration. The story of the Hittite Empire is not merely the story of power. It is the story of humanity, of resilience, ambition, creativity, and fragility. It is a reminder that civilizations rise not by accident, but through the choices of countless individuals whose lives, though separated from ours by thousands of years, were shaped by hopes, fears, dreams, and struggles strikingly similar to our own. And so, the tale continues through every excavation, every tablet deciphered, and every question yet unanswered. And so, as the kingdom of Hatti gathered momentum, its ambitions began to stretch beyond the forests and hills of Anatolia. Traders moved in and out of Hattusa, carrying goods that had once been rare luxuries: tin from the east, copper from the Taurus Mountains, textiles from the Aegean, horses from the north. Bit by bit, the Hittites refined the delicate art of diplomacy not through soft words and negotiated peace alone, but through the far older and far more intimidating language of strategic power. They understood something crucial. In a world of fragile alliances, the appearance of strength mattered almost as much as strength itself. Their neighbors watched them carefully, trying to calculate whether this newly rising kingdom would be a partner, and gradually, the balance tilted toward fear. Yet even as the Hittite state grew, it remained a patchwork, a confederation of lands held together by treaties, vassal loyalties, and the personal power of the king. It was not yet the empire history remembers. Its structure was brittle, vulnerable to both internal revolt and external assault. One unstable ruler, one major defeat, and the entire kingdom could collapse into tribal independence again. That moment nearly arrived, for in the shadows of Hittite history came a period scholars now refer to as the Dark Years, a time when chaos crept into the royal court, when brother fought brother and the throne became a seat of knives. The king's own relatives challenged his legitimacy. Provincial governors ignored royal decrees. Even the capital, Hattusa, saw unrest flare in its narrow streets. And as the kingdom fractured internally, foreign enemies sensed opportunity. The powerful kingdom of Aleppo in northern Syria, long a rival to Hatti, prepared to strike. The Hurrian states to the east sent spies into Hittite lands. The Assyrians watched with growing interest, evaluating how much longer this Anatolian kingdom could remain intact. But this turbulence would become the backdrop for the rise of one of the most consequential rulers in ancient history, Suppiluliuma I, the architect of the true Hittite Empire. Before he ascended the throne, however, the kingdom needed to survive the storm. The old king, Tudhaliya II, found himself forced into retreat, fleeing enemy invasions and internal uprisings. For a moment, it seemed the very idea of a unified Hittite realm was slipping away. The once proud capital, Hattusa, was abandoned after enemy attacks. Royal archives were burned. Temples were desecrated. The grand walls meant to protect the city now stood as symbols of failure, their stones blackened with soot. But the king was not without hope. Among his loyal supporters was a brilliant commander, Suppiluliuma, who had already demonstrated extraordinary leadership and military genius. He reorganized the scattered Hittite forces, secured supply lines, and launched targeted strikes to recapture rebellious territories. Slowly, he restored order. Slowly, he stabilized the kingdom. And slowly, he earned the respect of nobles and soldiers alike. When the old king died, Suppiluliuma stepped into the power vacuum, not timidly, not cautiously, but with the confidence of a man who understood destiny. The Hittite Empire, in many ways, begins with him. From the moment he assumed full authority, Superpower, moved with astonishing speed. He knew the Hittite state needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, and so he began securing alliances, strengthening the borders, and restructuring the army. But above all, he understood that the survival of his people depended on controlling the trade routes of Syria-rich cities that had long resisted Hittite influence. And so, the empire's greatest expansion began. The march south was not a single campaign but a series of masterful operations, each meticulously planned, each strategically essential. One by one, the Syrian states fell or submitted. Carchemish, Kadesh, Aleppo. These were not minor cities. They were the beating heart of the Near Eastern trade networks. Whoever controlled them controlled power. Superpower's victories transformed the regional order. The Egyptians, previously unchallenged in their influence over Syria, watched as the Hittites swept across the region like a rising tide. Panic rippled through the Egyptian court. For generations, pharaohs had believed themselves the natural overlords of the Levant. But now a new contender had stepped onto the stage. One who fought with both brilliance and relentlessness. Still, Egypt hesitated to act. Their internal politics were unraveling, their leaders distracted by court intrigue. This hesitation proved costly. For every month they delayed, another kingdom pledged loyalty to Superpower. Meanwhile, diplomacy played a subtle role in the Hittite expansion. Superpower was not merely a warrior, he was a strategist who manipulated rivalries, leveraged marriages, and negotiated loyalty with the skill of a seasoned statesman. Through treaties, he bound countless vassal states to the empire. Through royal marriages, he integrated foreign elites into the Hittite world. And through displays of overwhelming force, he ensured that even resistant cities understood the consequences of defiance. The empire that formed under Superpower was not just large, it was interconnected. Roads linked administrative centers. Messenger networks transmitted orders and reports with remarkable efficiency. The king's officials, known as Lords of the Watch, ensured loyalty across thousands of miles. It was a system far ahead of its time, flexible enough to survive local rebellions, and strong enough to maintain order. But the Hittites also possessed something else, something that gave them a military advantage no rival could ignore: their mastery of the chariot. To the Hittites, the chariot was not merely a vehicle of war. It was a symbol of royal power, a refined instrument of battlefield dominance. Their chariots were lighter, faster, and more maneuverable than those of their enemies. Crewed by 3 men instead of 2, a driver, a spearman, and a shield-bearer, they combined speed, stability, and offensive capability in ways unseen before. This innovation transformed ancient warfare, and it would soon bring the Hittites into direct confrontation with Egypt, on a scale the world had never witnessed. Yet before the clash at Kadesh, before the diplomatic turbulence that would define the late Bronze Age, a quieter, more intimate drama unfolded, one that revealed just how deeply Hittite influence had reached. This is the story of the infamous Zananza affair. In the Egyptian court, the young pharaoh Tutankhamun had died suddenly. His widow, left without a male heir and desperate to secure political stability, reached out not to an Egyptian noble, but to Superpower. She requested one of his sons, Prince Zananza, to become her husband and the next pharaoh of Egypt. This request shocked the Hittite king. Never before had an Egyptian queen asked for a foreign prince. After hesitation, negotiation, and verification, Superpower agreed. Zananza began his journey south, but he never arrived. Somewhere along the route, he was murdered, likely by forces loyal to the Egyptian general Horemheb or the courtier A. Superpower's rage was volcanic. He saw the act not merely as treachery but as an insult to his family and his empire. His retaliation against Egyptian-controlled lands was swift and merciless, plunging the region into deeper conflict. This moment, born of personal tragedy, would help set the stage for one of the greatest battles of the ancient world. But the rise of the Hittite Empire was not built on warfare alone. Behind the scenes, the empire's cultural identity was evolving in equally transformative ways. In the cities of Hatti, scribes, recorded laws, treaties, and myths in the cuneiform script texts that reveal a civilization both complex and deeply spiritual. Their law codes emphasized compensation over corporal punishment. Their myths blended Indo-European traditions with Mesopotamian and Anatolian influences. Their temples, with their cultic festivals and intricate rites, formed the backbone of the empire's religious life. And at the heart of this culture was the king, both warrior and high priest, ruler and intermediary between the gods and the people. The Hittite worldview held that the stability of the cosmos depended on the king's piety and justice. A negligent ruler could bring famine. A corrupt ruler could bring disaster. The Hittites did not rise by accident. But even as the empire reached the height of its strength, new challenges loomed. Foreign rivals, rebellious vassals, unpredictable weather patterns, economic strains, and the ever-present threat of internal drama. For the Hittite Empire, like all great powers, would discover that expansion was only the first step. Maintaining that power would require even greater skill, sacrifice, and sometimes unavoidable conflict. And the greatest of those conflicts was now approaching. And so, as the Hittite Empire expanded into the rich lands of Syria, as alliances were forged and rival kingdoms subdued, the world of the Late Bronze Age drifted toward one of its most defining confrontations. Two titanic powers now faced one another across the contested land of the Levant. Egypt in the south, Inwentu, confident in its ancient prestige, and the Hittites in the north. The stage was set for a collision not born from a single grievance, but from decades of accumulated tension, ambition, and overlapping spheres of influence. At its center lay the fortress city of Kadesh, a strategically priceless hub that both powers viewed as essential to their territorial integrity and regional dominance. But before the armies marched, before the wheels of thousands of chariots thundered across the plains, the Hittite Empire entered a period of internal refinement and outward confidence. Under Suppiluliuma's rule, administration became more standardized. Royal officials stationed across the empire sent detailed reports to Hattusa. Grain storage systems improved, ensuring that cities could withstand sieges. The empire was becoming not merely vast, but sophisticated. The royal archives, those same tablets discovered millennia, later reveal a bureaucracy that functioned with surprising precision. Correspondence flowed between the king and his vassals. Treaties were written in formal, legally binding language, carved into clay that would survive long after the cities themselves fell. And woven into these diplomatic documents were glimpses of the Hittite worldview. A belief in oaths, sanctified by gods, in loyalty enforced by divine witness, and in cosmic repercussions for betrayal. Yet for all the empire's strength, its stability remained tied to the personality of its ruler. And when he died, likely weakened by the plague brought back by prisoners from Egypt, the empire trembled again. His son Arnuwanda briefly inherited the throne but soon succumbed to the same devastating illness. It was then that the mantle of leadership fell onto Mursili II, a young man thrust into power at a moment of deep vulnerability. In another time, in another context, such a transition might have doomed the empire. But Mursili proved himself a ruler as determined and capable as his father. His early reign was consumed with quelling rebellions in the Kadesh region, in the mountainous lands to the north, and among the restless states of Syria. Each uprising threatened to unravel the very fabric of imperial authority. But rather than retreat into caution, Mursili embarked on a series of relentless campaigns, demonstrating a resolve that astonished both foes and allies. One of the most remarkable aspects of his reign lies not only in military efficacy but in his introspection. The plague prayers of Mursili, recorded in the royal archives, reveal a king deeply aware of human fragility and divine influence. In them, he laments the loss of his father and brother, seeking the gods' forgiveness and guidance. It is rare in ancient history to glimpse the vulnerability of a ruler, and rarer still to find it expressed with such sincerity. But the empire's challenges would not end with Mursili. As the generations passed, the Hittites continued to face the same delicate balance that had shaped their rise. the need to project power abroad while maintaining order at home. The Hittites continued to face, or faced in the face. Syria remained both a jewel and a burden. A land of wealth, but also of restless cities, foreign intrigues, and competing loyalties. And it was in this contested landscape that a future king, Hattusa III, began to carve out his legacy. Hattusa's story is one of ambition, rivalry, and political complexity. Born into a royal family intertwined with intrigue, he was both a skilled military commander and a shrewd manipulator of internal politics. As a younger prince, he governed the region of Hattusa, defending the empire's northern frontier against the aggressive Kaska tribes. His success earned him respect among soldiers and administrators alike, but it also attracted suspicion within the royal court. The reigning king, Urhiteshub, also known as Mursili III, viewed Hattusili's growing influence as a threat. Tensions escalated, accusations were exchanged, and a slow-burning conflict erupted between the throne and the ambitious prince. Ultimately, Hattusili launched a calculated coup, ousting his nephew and claiming the kingship for himself. It was a bold and controversial move, one that would reshape the empire's destiny. With the crown now in his hands, Hattusili III faced both skepticism and opportunity. To legitimize his reign, he embraced diplomacy as fervently as his predecessors embraced conquest. And it was in this spirit that he initiated one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of the ancient world: a formal peace treaty with Egypt. For years, conflict between the Hittites and Egyptians had raged through the lands of Syria. Cities changed hands. Armies marched, retreated, and regrouped. The Battle of Kadesh, though often remembered as a single dramatic clash, was but one chapter in a decades-long struggle. But by Hattusili's time, both empires were exhausted, resources strained, soldiers weary. The peoples of Syria, caught between two giants. And so, the peace treaty between Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II was not simply a political gesture. It was a monumental shift in Near Eastern diplomacy. The treaty itself survives in multiple copies on clay tablets in Hattusa and carved into temple walls in Egypt. Its language speaks of mutual respect, mutual assistance, and an agreement that neither side would harm the other's interests. It is, in many ways, the world's earliest known international peace treaty with surviving text. For the Hittites, this peace brought stability. Freed from the constant need to defend their southern borders, they redirected resources inward, strengthening their cities, investing in agriculture, and nurturing cultural development. The royal court in Hattusa flourished, becoming a hub of artistic and intellectual activity. The empire, now at its zenith, stood as one of the ancient world's most formidable powers. Yet beneath the polished surface of power, subtle cracks began to form. Trade routes that once flowed freely now experienced disruptions. Climate patterns shifted, bringing years of drought to parts of Anatolia. Crop failures became more frequent. The empire's dependence on imported grain increased, and far beyond the horizon, migratory populations and raiding groups began to stir forces that would eventually contribute to the collapse of multiple Bronze Age civilizations. But these distant threats were not yet fully understood by the Hittites. In the glow of diplomatic triumph and territorial stability, the empire looked outward with confidence. Its kings believed they had secured a lasting place in the world. Its people continued the rituals and festivals that bound their communities together. Its scribes preserved the laws, myths, and histories that shaped the identity of the Hittite state. Still, destiny had already begun to shift. For in the twilight of the Bronze Age, a storm was gathering, one that would sweep across continents, disrupt empires, and erase entire cultures from the map. And the Hittites, despite their strength, their diplomacy, and their military innovations, would find themselves caught in the center of it. But before that storm arrives, the empire will experience its final chapter of grandeur, a last period of prosperity, ambition, and cultural flowering, a moment of brilliance before the darkness descends. And that moment begins with the next reign, the next challenge, and the next turning point in the story of the Hittite Empire. And so, with the signing of peace between Hatti and Egypt, with diplomatic relations now cemented by marriages and mutual assurances, the Hittite Empire entered what would become its final century of power. A century defined not by expansion, but by consolidation. Not by glory, but by endurance. And eventually, by the weight of challenges too vast for any Bronze Age kingdom to withstand. In the wake of Hattusa III's diplomatic triumph, his son, Tudhalia IV, ascended the throne. He inherited not only a stabilized kingdom but also the expectations of a world that had grown accustomed to the Hittites as a dominant force. Tudhalia was young, ambitious, and deeply religious. He sought to restore what he believed were neglected rituals, forgotten festivals, and ancient divine obligations that he feared had been overlooked during years of war. Under his leadership, at least in the early years, the empire experienced renewed spiritual vitality. Temples were repaired. Sacred cities received royal patronage. Rituals once lost to time were revived. To Tudhalia, divine favor was the foundation of imperial strength. If the gods were pleased, the land would flourish. If the gods were angered, even the greatest armies would falter. But faith alone could not shield the empire from the shifting realities of the late Bronze Age. For beyond the eastern mountains, the Assyrians were rising rapidly. Their kings, disciplined and ruthless, were laying the foundation for what would become one of the most formidable imperial systems in human history. Assyria's ambitions were unmistakable. Their armies pushed westward, their scribes boasting of conquests, tributes, and the humiliation of rival kings. The Hittites watched with growing unease. In the west, tensions simmered with the growing power of the Mycenaean Greeks across the Aegean. Trade networks that had once linked Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Greek mainland became increasingly strained. Piracy disrupted shipping routes. Merchants complained of insecurity. Cities along the coast fortified their walls. And in Anatolia itself, the old enemy, the Kaska tribes of the northern mountains, continued to pressure Hittite borders with raids, ambushes, and sudden assaults. Though they never forged a kingdom of their own, their persistence drained military resources year after year. These external pressures alone would have tested any empire. But something even more devastating simmered beneath the surface: environmental instability. Across the ancient Near East, tree ring data, sediment cores, and textual records all point to a troubling pattern: prolonged drought. Harvests failed repeatedly. Grain became scarce. Streams dried to trickles. Farmers struggled, and with their hardship came unrest. The Hittite Empire, heavily dependent on agricultural taxation and grain storage, began to feel the strain acutely. Tudhalia IV understood the gravity of the situation. In one of the most impressive engineering feats of the ancient world, he ordered the construction of the dam at Alakahoyuk, one of the earliest known hydraulic engineering projects designed to secure water against drought. The remains of this dam still exist today, silent testimony to a king fighting desperately against forces beyond human control. But infrastructure could not entirely counter the coming storm. Disruption of trade meant a shortage of essential goods. Bronze, for instance, required tin, a metal the Hittites did not produce domestically. Their chariot armies, once unmatched, struggled to acquire the resources needed to maintain their elite weaponry. Grain deliveries from vassal territories grew unreliable. Portions of the empire began slipping into semi-independence as the royal court found it increasingly difficult to project authority across the vast, rugged lands of Anatolia and Syria. Meanwhile, internal politics, always a delicate dance in Hittite tradition, grew increasingly tangled. Letters found in archives reveal urgent pleas from loyal rulers begging for troops, warning that rival kings were turning away from Hattusa. The empire was no longer feared as it once had been. Even in its heartland, tensions quietly mounted. The court of Hattusa, once thriving with scribes, diplomats, and priests, now felt the pressure of diminishing resources. Clay tablets from this period show a growing concern with tribute, taxes, and shortages. Bureaucratic anxiety seeped into every aspect of administration. And then, something far larger than any single kingdom began to unfold. Movements of people, entire populations on the move, groups whose identities remain partly mysterious in the archaeological record. These migrations, violent, unpredictable, and vast in scale, would reshape the world of the Bronze Age. Later Egyptian texts called some of them the Sea Peoples, though they were not a single people, nor a unified force. They were coalitions, fragments, refugees, raiders, and warriors whose movements rippled across the Mediterranean. Cities burned across the Levant, trade collapsed, established powers crumbled. The Hittite Empire, positioned at the crossroads of Anatolia and Syria, felt the first tremors. Communication with far-flung territories became sporadic. Reports of enemy landings along the coast reached the capital. Caravans vanished. Entire port cities went silent. And as coastal regions destabilized, the shockwaves moved inland, disrupting everything from agriculture to military logistics. Tudhalia IV fought to hold the center together. He launched campaigns. He reaffirmed treaties. He attempted to keep the empire functioning through sheer force of will. But the mounting challenges were no longer matters of misfortune or military setback. They were systemic. When Tudhalia died, his successors inherited a kingdom under siege, not by a single enemy, but by a collapsing world system. In the final decades of Hittite history, power shifted to Suppiluliuma II. He was a competent ruler, energetic and determined. He even engaged in what appears to be the earliest recorded naval battle in history, an attempt to repel raiders off the Mediterranean coast. His inscriptions proudly recount victories on the sea, a sign of how the nature of warfare had changed. But despite these efforts, the empire's foundations were failing. Climate change had weakened agriculture. Trade networks had disintegrated. Vassal states were breaking away. The economy was starved of resources, and waves of migrating or raiding groups, some from the west, others from the sea, others still from the fringes of Anatolia, were stripping the land bare. Ultimately, Hattusa could no longer sustain itself. One day, no one knows the exact year, but sometime around 1200 BCE, the capital was abandoned. Not conquered in a glorious final battle, not extinguished by a single overwhelming foe, but silently emptied as its people fled to survive elsewhere. The once mighty city, with its towering gates and sacred temples, with its royal archives and colossal fortifications, was left to the winds and wild animals. The empire of the Hittites simply ceased to exist. For centuries afterward, no one spoke their name. Their cities fell into ruin. Their writing system vanished. Their identity faded from memory. To the civilizations that followed, the Hittites became ghosts, forgotten, buried, erased. Only in the early 20th century did archaeologists rediscover their lost world, uncovering tablets that revealed an empire as sophisticated, powerful, and influential as Egypt, Babylon, or Assyria. An empire that shaped diplomacy, warfare, and law in ways the world had forgotten. And so, the rise of the Hittite Empire, its untold triumphs, innovations, struggles, and ultimate disappearance stands as one of the most compelling stories of the ancient world. A story of human ambition, of fragile power, of monumental achievement, and of the relentless forces of history that spare no kingdom, no matter how mighty. For centuries after the fall of Hattusa, the Hittites existed only as whispers in the texts of other civilizations, fleeting mentions in Egyptian inscriptions, scattered references in the Hebrew Bible, faint echoes in ancient myths whose origins had long been forgotten. Their own voice, their own words, seemed to have vanished forever. To the scholars of antiquity, the Hittites were little more than a footnote, a mysterious people whose identity remained unclear. Some doubted they had ever existed at all. The world had forgotten them. Beneath layers of dust, beneath toppled stone walls and collapsed chambers, beneath shattered pottery and long-rotted wooden beams, the Hittites still slept, waiting for the day their story would rise again. That day began unexpectedly. In the late 19th century, when reports emerged of strange hieroglyphic inscriptions carved into the stones of Anatolia, not Egyptian hieroglyphs, but a different script, similar in style, yet unmistakably unique. Explorers encountered them in isolated mountain passes, in abandoned ruins, in long-forgotten shrines. Scholars puzzled over the symbols, unable to decipher their origin or meaning. Were they the remnants of a lost people, a forgotten language, a vanished civilization? At first, few understood the significance. It was only when archaeologists began excavating a site in central Turkey, a place locals called Boğazköy, that the mystery deepened. Beneath the soil, they uncovered walls stretching across hillsides, gates adorned with lions, and monumental structures unlike anything found in the region. This was not a village, not a small city, but the ruins of something vast, powerful, and unmistakably ancient. The deeper they dug, the more astonishing the discoveries became. Clay tablets, hundreds of them, thousands of them inscribed in cuneiform. Contracts, treaties, chronicles, myths. Entire libraries preserved in the silence of collapsed palaces. Buried archives revealing the names of kings, the details of wars, the rites of gods. The tablets spoke of a mighty empire, an empire centered right where the archaeologists were standing. Piece by piece, scholars began to realize the truth. This forgotten city was Hattusa, the capital of the Hittites, and the world had just rediscovered an empire. It was one of the greatest archaeological revelations of the modern age, a civilization erased from human memory, suddenly speaking again in its own words. The tablets told of Supululiuma, Mursili, Hattusili. They described battles with Egypt, treaties signed with pharaohs, letters exchanged between kings. They revealed a world of diplomacy and law, of administrative complexity, of religious devotion. They illuminated a people who had stood among the great powers of the ancient world, and they shattered the long-held assumption that the Bronze Age Near East had been dominated only by Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. The Hittites emerged as a fourth pillar, equal in power, influence, and sophistication. One of the most extraordinary aspects of the discovery was the preservation of their treaties. Among them was the treaty between Hattusili III and Ramses II, the same treaty whose Egyptian version was carved on temple walls. Now, scholars could compare the two sides of the agreement, word for word. For the first time in history, we had both versions of an international treaty from the ancient world, offering unparalleled insight into diplomacy more than 3,000 years old. As excavations continued throughout the 20th century, new discoveries reshaped modern understanding of the Hittites. Their art, their architecture, their administrative system all revealed a civilization both familiar and distinct. They borrowed from their neighbors, yet innovated in their own unique ways. Their chariot design, their legal codes, their diplomatic sophistication all were far ahead of their time. But perhaps the most remarkable surprise was the nature of their religion. Unlike many ancient powers, the Hittites were not eager to impose their gods on conquered peoples. Instead, they absorbed divine figures from every culture they encountered. Their pantheon grew into a vast tapestry of deities, so many that scribes referred to them as the 1,000 gods of Hatti. It was a worldview that embraced diversity, that saw the sacred in many forms, that wove together faiths from across Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia. This openness gave modern scholars a window into the spiritual landscape of the ancient Near East, a landscape richer and more interconnected than anyone had imagined. As decades passed, archaeologists uncovered more sites. Yazilikaya, with its carved chamber of gods marching across stone. Sapinua, a secondary capital hidden in the mountains. Alakahoyuk, with its ancient sanctuaries and royal tombs. Carchemish, the powerful imperial outpost along the Euphrates. Each revealed another chapter in the Hittite story, fragments of life, fragments of belief, fragments of a world once lost. And through these discoveries, the Hittites, once silent, began to speak again. But perhaps the greatest revelation was what their story ultimately represents: the fragility of civilization. The realization that even the mightiest kingdoms can be undone by forces they cannot control. Climate, migration, economic collapse, political fragmentation. The fall of the Hittites was not a single catastrophe, but the slow unraveling of a system stretched beyond its limits. Their rediscovery reminds us that history is not a straight line. It is a tapestry woven from countless threads, some bright, some dark, some forgotten for centuries. Civilizations rise, civilizations fall, and sometimes they disappear so completely that the world forgets they ever existed. The Hittites teach us that memory itself is fragile, and yet, in the quiet hills of central Turkey, where the ruins of Hattusa rest beneath wind and sky, their legacy endures. The Lion Gate still stands. The great temple still whispers of forgotten rituals. The royal archives still preserve the words of kings who once believed their empire would last forever. Today, scholars walk the same paths once trodden by priests, soldiers, and scribes. They stand in the shadow of walls, reconstructed stone by stone. They hold in their hands the same clay tablets that kings touched 3 millennia ago. And in those moments, the ancient world comes alive again. Because the rise of the Hittite Empire is not merely a story of conquest or diplomacy or collapse. It is a story of discovery, a story of resilience, a story of how human achievement can vanish, and yet return through the persistence of curiosity. And in that sense, the Hittites never truly disappeared. They were waiting hidden in the earth until the modern world was finally ready to listen. And so, as we step back from the dust of ruined citadels and the echoing corridors of time, the rise of the Hittite Empire stands before us, not only as a chapter of ancient history, but as a testament to humanity's complex, resilient, and inventive spirit. What began as scattered highland settlements in the Anatolian plateau transformed into a power capable of challenging the mightiest forces of the Late Bronze Age. From the fortified gates of Hattusa, to the battlefields of Kadesh, to the courts where treaties were carved into clay and sealed with divine oaths, the Hittites shaped a world that would continue to influence centuries that followed. Their warriors, clad in bronze and leather, marched across harsh landscapes not for glory alone, but for survival. Their kings ruled through a delicate blend of divine mandate, military authority, and political negotiation, and their scribes quiet architects of memory, preserved in cuneiform, the triumphs, failures, and anxieties of a civilization striving to assert its identity in a turbulent age. Even in their decline, the Hittites left an imprint that outlived their kingdom. Their laws informed later legal traditions. Their diplomacy, particularly the peace treaty with Egypt, laid foundations for international agreements millennia later. And their mythology seeped into the growing narrative of the ancient Near East, influencing cultures yet to emerge. Though their empire crumbled, though their cities fell to flames and abandonment, their legacy endured. Rediscovered only in the past 150 years, the Hittites have risen once more. This time not with chariot and spear, but through archaeology, research, and the persistent curiosity of those who seek to understand the world's forgotten civilizations. Their story reminds us that history is never a straight line. Power rises and falls. Cities flourish and fade. But the echoes of human achievement continue long after the stones have fallen. The Hittites were once lost to time, dismissed as little more than shadows in ancient texts, yet now, pieced back together from clay tablets and ruined temples, their empire stands again in the light of understanding. They were builders, diplomats, conquerors, engineers, lawmakers, storytellers, an entire world hidden beneath our feet, waiting centuries to be heard. This is the untold rise of the Hittite Empire. A rise forged through determination, conflict, diplomacy, and innovation. A rise that reshaped the political and cultural landscape of its age. And a rise that, even today, challenges us to look deeper, question assumptions, and recognize the vast interconnectedness of the ancient world. If this journey through a forgotten empire has sparked your curiosity, there is so much more still hidden in the earth, waiting to be uncovered, explored, and understood. And together, we can bring it all back to life. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep exploration into ancient history, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another long-form documentary. Your support helps us continue unearthing the stories of civilizations that shaped our world. Until next time, this is Ages Past, inviting you to keep exploring the mysteries of history, one empire at a time. Subscribe now.